Today's video is all about the creative economy of New Mexico, its relationship to craft or handmade goods, and its global value. To begin, what is the creative economy? First of all, I interchange the terms creative economy, cultural economy, and craft economy because they are all umbrella terms for basically the same thing. The general term is creative economy. That's what most scholars and academics use today. And what that is all industries that relate to creativity. So music, film, TV, art, literature, design, graphic design, editing, architecture, all of those things belong to the creative economy. It's also important to note that in terms of creative economy, it's not just the individual artists or craftspeople or makers that are part of those groups that are included in the creative economy. It's also all of the industries that surround that work. A great example of this would be to think of an arts-related institution. I'm going to give the example of an art museum. The art within the museum is obviously of great value and would be included in creative economy numbers, but more importantly, the people who work at that museum, the building itself, its facilities, its social impact, its cultural impact for the community that it's within, all of those things are actually part of the creative economy as well, and oftentimes are things that we forget about. As a cultural economist, I tend to think less of the traditional economic value of things. Instead of thinking about supply and demand and economic value in terms of money, I think of value in terms of social and cultural impact. That could mean how something creates community or how something creates value for the individuals that are near it. But it's still important to understand the economic value of something like the creative economy. So to think about some global numbers, in 2013, a book called The Orange Economy was released by Felipe Restrepo and Ivan Duque, who are two Brazilian researchers who did an amazing amount of work on trying to find a face value for the creative economy, or what they call the orange economy. These researchers compiled a lot of data that is useful in gaining an understanding of just how big the creative economy really is. They found that globally, exports of creative goods and services reached $646 billion in 2011, making those exports the fifth highest global export in 2012. And according to the UN Conference on Trade and Development, creative goods and services exports grew 134% between 2002 and 2011. The creative economy has value and is therefore important in a traditional economic sense. So those were some global numbers about the creative economy, but how do our local numbers here in Albuquerque look? In 2017, I was hired to conduct a survey for the Albuquerque Downtown Arts and Cultural District to measure the impact of our city's creative economy and to learn more about the needs of individual creative entrepreneurs and artists, businesses, and organizations. So Albuquerque's Downtown Arts and Cultural District is made up of approximately 30 blocks in and around the Central Avenue corridor. So from UNM campus, if you just head west down Central and you reach the downtown area, that's sort of the area we're talking about. So one of my favorite pieces of data that I collected from this research is this graph of employer type that we asked about. So of the creatives surveyed in Albuquerque, 47.5% were self-employed. Because nearly half of creatives in Albuquerque are self-employed, this to me shows that the arts and cultural industries in Albuquerque, at least, and probably in most of New Mexico, are self-driven. There aren't necessarily a lot of institutions available for artists to work with, or maybe there aren't enough institutions for the amount of artists that want to work and live in Albuquerque. The second piece of data here shows where the participants' primary income comes from. About 40% of participants say that their creative work is not their primary source of income. Only 60% of the participants claimed that their artistic or creative endeavor was their primary source of income. So what that means is that a lot of these artists or creatives couldn't support themselves fully on that creative endeavor. So that's something really interesting. So in the context of New Mexico, I want to talk about our three large arts markets that happen here every year. It's important to look at these markets because they're a great example of how global issues can affect local markets or how geopolitical issues as well within the nation can impact markets. We have three of the highest grossing, most visited arts markets in the world: Spanish market, Indian market, and the international folk art market. The Spanish market includes art in the Spanish colonial tradition and usually pulls artists primarily from New Mexico and sometimes from Colorado. Spanish colonial art is things like traditionally painted retablos, jewelry, metalwork, anything done in the traditional Spanish colonial style. Then Indian market. Indian market features the best Native American artists particularly from New Mexico and the Four Corners area. And it combines both traditional measures of creating the work and traditional design alongside artists who are using new techniques and new designs to reestablish Native American art in New Mexico and in the country. And finally, the International Folk Art Market has been happening for over 15 years in Santa Fe, and it brings together artists from all over the world who are considered folk artists or craftsmen, crafts artists. And these artisans are from over 120 countries. There are usually about 150 artists every year that go, and they come and they showcase their work, they tell their stories over a weekend, and they sell their work. Although these markets take place in New Mexico and in the United States specifically, they're still impacted by global events, and they definitely have an international management component, especially the International Folk Art Market. COVID-19 is a great example of how a global pandemic, a global issue, became something that impacted us locally. Obviously, it's impacting everyone around the world, but particularly for these markets were canceled this year. When we think about the International Folk Art Market, for example, let's think about it trying to move online or being a virtual market this year. Many of the artists that come to the market might be from rural areas, and so it might be really difficult for them to, one, have solid internet connection, two, take photos of their work. They might not have the tools or the time to do that. And so it's really challenging for these artists to participate in some sort of virtual market. Of course, the other thing that comes along with that, if they did do a virtual market, then the question becomes, okay, how do you ship all of your work to different places, maybe around the world, maybe in the United States? That time and money that it would take to do that for these artists is just not feasible. It's hard enough on a normal year without a pandemic to get these artists and their work to the United States, to clear customs, to get them visas. It's extremely challenging, and so throwing in a pandemic as well and trying to do a virtual market is just kind of out of the question. On an average year, this market in 48 hours of being open generates over $3 million. 80 to 90% of proceeds from the market goes straight to the artists themselves. Many of the artists that go to the folk art market in Santa Fe find that a large percent of their annual income comes from selling their work at this specific market. Without this market, they might not have the money to participate in the market next year when it reopens, or they might not have the money to purchase materials to continue their craft. When I worked for the International Folk Art Market in 2018, I was in charge of getting all the shipments into the United States from other countries. And customs officials have a lot of paperwork and documentation that's required to transport anything into the United States, especially from certain countries. It's hugely challenging to navigate different language barriers and different customs paperwork, and this thing needs this stamp from this person, and this piece of paper needs to be filled out in this way, and we need to have a really detailed log of all of the materials within this product. All of these things are really challenging. The travel ban that the Trump administration imposed really made it difficult to get artists into the country. Typically, the folk art market has artists come along with their product to represent themselves and tell their stories. Art is so personal, and being able to tell your story and why the art is valuable. To have someone say, look, this is a tapestry I made, and I literally spent 6 months making this one beautiful tapestry. It's much more valuable to hear that from the mouth of the artist themselves instead of just from someone trying to sell the work to you who might not be super familiar with that work. Being able to tell the tradition of the artwork is part of the value of this market. Without the artists there, it was much harder to sell the work of those artists. So our artists from Middle Eastern countries, artists from Cuba, struggled to get visas to come into the nation. So that's a good example of a geopolitical issue that made it difficult for this one market in Santa Fe to happen, which made it difficult for some of the artists across the world as well. Something that comes with the territory of hosting markets that are specific to certain groups of people is cultural appropriation and other social and cultural issues. Oftentimes, organizations that seek to support, uplift, or empower artisans from specific communities don't have good representation of those communities within their organizational structure. It's important to have the voices of the people you're helping within the organization. Sometimes you are attempting to help someone that doesn't need help or doesn't want help. And sometimes you can help people in an incorrect way. Not everybody needs the same things that you need or wants the same things that you want. Not having a Native American person on the board of the Indian market board of directors would obviously be detrimental to the market. I'm not saying that this is something that's happening, that's just an example. Another thing I've seen at some of these markets is a tendency for patrons to seemingly collect the artists or overpower their stories. I've seen patrons at the folk art market specifically boast about spending tens of thousands of dollars at the market, retell the artists' stories to their friends, oftentimes incorrectly, and sometimes misuse pieces of art they've bought. Many traditional art forms or crafts have specific uses or specific meaning, and so there are times that you can misuse or misappropriate the culture. These markets are amazing opportunities for people of different cultures to connect and learn about one another and support one another. But it's also really important to understand the impact that patrons and organizers of these markets have on the artists themselves, their cultures, and their worldview. Markets like these wouldn't be successful in other states in the US because New Mexico is so uniquely positioned as a wonderful collection of cultures already. Basically, what I'm saying is that these markets are phenomenal and they're successful because New Mexico is such a unique place. These markets probably wouldn't be as successful as they are anywhere else in the United States. We have a wonderful heritage of Spanish colonial art, of Native American art, and we still have people, descendants that have been here for generations from both groups of people. Creative economy is one of the places where New Mexico succeeds the most. Santa Fe is actually considered the third largest city for arts in the country. Meow Wolf was started in 2008, and it's become a multi-million-dollar industry in the last 12 years. If you're unfamiliar with Meow Wolf, it's an interactive, immersive art experience built out of an old bowling alley in Santa Fe. A huge group of different artists came together to create and build this art installation, which is called the House of Eternal Return. It features over 70 rooms that change as different artists are invited to create within the space. It's closed right now because of COVID-19 restrictions, but it's a great example of how New Mexico's creative economy is adapting and growing in unique ways. It's also a great example of an arts institution that is for profit. Many arts institutions are nonprofits, but Meow Wolf has found a way to become extremely profitable and continue generating revenue year after year. Last year alone, Meow Wolf raised over $158 million for its expansions to Las Vegas and Denver through about 85 investors. They also support 350 employees, so they're becoming a really important part of our cultural and creative economy here in New Mexico. Meow Wolf has also worked to position itself alongside other important cultural institutions in New Mexico, particularly through its partnership with New Mexico's new football club, New Mexico United. Like many organizations that grow quickly, Meow Wolf isn't without its issues and has faced backlash for and criticism for being, and I quote, vaguely colonial and tone deaf. But nonetheless, it remains a great example of creative economy growth for New Mexico. My research focuses on craft and craft commons. The commons are basically communities of people who work together to learn more or to accomplish more. New Mexico is one of the only places in the United States where craft commons exist. Because of our longstanding traditions and our cultural heritage here, we are really uniquely positioned to have these wonderful arts markets and these groups of people who continue their traditions indefinitely. I think craft especially, or handmade goods, are becoming more popular throughout the country. The return to a desire for minimalism or having better quality and fewer goods is becoming more and more popular. Consumers are trying to move away from fast fashion and towards sustainable and better quality clothing and goods. Another important cultural industry that was in part founded in New Mexico is Etsy. If you're familiar with Etsy, it's basically an online marketplace where people make goods and sell them. And one of the co-founders of Etsy, his name is Jared Tarbell, and he's from Albuquerque. We of course have a number of wonderful art museums in Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and other parts of New Mexico. We have a huge tradition of fiber artists up in northern New Mexico.
And if you're at all interested in learning about any of these organizations, I'm going to post links to all of their websites down in the description below. And I definitely encourage you to try and learn more about all of these great institutions that make up a huge part of the creative economy of New Mexico and why it's so valuable.
So I've given a brief overview of the creative economy's value as a whole. A few examples of creative industries in New Mexico, like our wonderful arts markets, some of our local arts institutions, and places like Meow Wolf. And I've tried to show how global events, like, of course, the pandemic, and geopolitical issues like our administration's travel ban can impact our cultural industries here in New Mexico. Thank you.